Well, it's already the third week of Lent. And so we're in the third week of our message series for Lent, which we've been calling Catholic Guilt. Catholic guilt can arise in so many ways. A long time ago, when I was in the seminary studying to be a priest, we had a spring break. On Friday of that week, I was at home enjoying the break, and I decided to make a nice lunch for myself. There was some ground beef in the refrigerator and some leftover bacon, so I decided to make a nice burger. I sauteed some onions and added Swiss cheese and put it all on a toasted English muffin. Yum. So I sat down at the table, and as I'm about to take my first bite, I realized it was the first Friday of Lent. What a dilemma. Here I am in the seminary preparing for the priesthood, about to bite into a juicy bacon burger on the first Friday of Lent. Well, my first thought was, nobody's here. No one will know. And it's a sin to waste food. And then I thought, my mother's going to figure it out. Talk about guilt. Catholic guilt and mother guilt. It was a no-win situation. So, my friends, this is confession. I ate the burger. And I felt guilty for days. In this series, we're digging into this idea of Catholic guilt because Catholic guilt can get in the way of Catholic faith. And of course, no matter if you're Catholic or not, we all experience guilt, shame, regret, and remorse. It's part of life. So we began this series looking at the concept of original sin. Sin is very simply about missing the mark. In life, we aim to do the right thing, but we don't always hit the target. The concept of original sin doesn't have to do with anything we did. It's about our innate human tendency to curve inward. Original sin doesn't mean that you're innately bad. In fact, the Bible tells us that humans are innately good. Original sin, curving inward, is about our tendency to choose to serve ourselves first instead of serving God or others first. When we understand our human predisposition to curve inward, we can accept that failing and falling short is a part of life. And this understanding can free us of guilt and shame and open us up to the good news and grace of a relationship with the living, loving God. Last week, we looked at the concept of shame, starting with how guilt and shame are different. Guilt is action-based. Guilt says, I did something bad. But shame is identity-based. Shame says, I am bad. Shame is damaging and dangerous to our souls. Shame is born in us when we listen to the critical voices of others or our own self-critical voice. We believe the lie that we are actually bad to our core, that we're beyond help or fixing or forgiving. Shame has a field day when we listen to those voices. If we want to begin healing from our shame, we need to change what and who we're listening to. We need to stop listening to shame and start listening to God's voice and God's truth, particularly about who we are as his beloved children, never beyond his love or compassion or care. One great way to listen for God's voice in this season of Lent is to join us for our first ever worship night coming up on Thursday, March 30th. This will be a more casual gathering than Sunday Mass. and a great chance to build that skill of learning to listen for God's voice in our lives and when we gather for worship. We hope you'll join us for that on March 30th at 7 p.m. This week, we're continuing to look at the topic of shame by looking at this incredible story in today's gospel. It's a long story, but so rich with wisdom and insight when it comes to dealing with guilt and shame. The gospel writer John tells a very unusual and very unexpected story about Jesus' encounter with a woman at a well. It begins like this. Jesus, tired from his journey, sat down at the well. It was about noon. A woman of Samaria came to draw water. Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." Jesus and his disciples are tired from traveling. While the disciples go into town to get food, Jesus sits down to rest at the well just outside of town. Now, Jews and Samaritans hated each other, which is why the woman quickly responds, "How can you, a Jew, ask me, a Samaritan woman, for a drink?" Not only was she a Samaritan, but she was a Samaritan woman. In that culture, for a man to even make eye contact with a woman in a public place would have been considered taboo. And to speak to her directly bordered on scandalous. In a culture that dismissed women and put them a step below, Jesus consistently lifted women up, initiating conversation and relationship, and seeing their potential and inviting them to so much more. So did you notice that it said it was about noon? Might seem like a random detail, but in the scriptures, nothing is random. And this detail is critical to understand what's going on in this story. In that culture, it was the job of the women to get water for their families every day. It was a lot of work to lug a bucket or a jug to the well and fill it with water and bring it back home. And at noon, it would likely have been blisteringly hot. No one would go fetch their water at noon. But this woman does, because she's an outcast. She's not accepted by the women that lug their water in the morning and, of course, spent that time gabbing and socializing while they did it. So she has to come in the middle of the day. Why is she an outcast? Well, the story gives us the answer. Jesus said to her, "Go call your husband and come back." The woman answered and said to him, "I do not have a husband." Jesus answered her, "You are right in saying, 'I do not have a husband,' for you have had 5 husbands, and the one you have now is not your husband. What you have said is true." Now, there's nothing in this story to tell us about the details of this woman's marriages, but clearly it's complicated, and clearly it's brought her shame. That's why she's not here at the regular time. That's why she can't hang out with the other women. This is a snapshot of how shame affects us. It leads us to isolate ourselves from others, and it impacts our everyday habits and routines. The interesting thing is that this woman is allowing shame to drive her life. Jesus knows this. He sees it. And out of compassion, he addresses it with her. Jesus doesn't add to her shame. He sees her shame and he wants to bring it to the surface so he can heal her from it. Jesus is not at all accusatory here. He's compassionate, patient, and gentle with this woman, which is the opposite of what she's like to herself, the opposite of how other people are treating her. He spoke gently, without shaming her or laughing at her. Just a simple statement of truth. And beyond that, a statement of knowing. He sees her. He sees it all, even the stuff she most wants to hide. And it's exactly this outpouring of love and respect that breaks through the walls of shame, the buried lies that she'd been telling herself. They engage in an incredible conversation with Jesus patiently nudging her to step away from her usual manner of thinking and to trust in the God of spirit and truth. Though the woman was embarrassed by her failure and rejected by others because of her past, Jesus saw only her future. Jesus invites her out of her prison of shame and gives her room to breathe and a vision for her future. Jesus shows her that he believes in her and that she's worthy of his love, brave enough to see the truth and strong enough to follow him to discover the living water she was craving. Bottom line of this whole interaction, this whole story, is that Jesus is not in the business of giving us shame. Jesus is in the business of freeing us from our shame. And he knows that we need to actually see it to heal from it. We can't begin to heal from something that we refuse to admit even exists. Secrets and shame can distort our entire lives without our being completely aware of it. Often, a part of our mind tries to hide it from us, or we simply adapt to it. But things we hide or hide from can cause emotional and physical illness until they're faced. When we're living with a past haunted by regret, we believe the lie that we are unlovable, worthless, and insignificant. We avoid our inner desert because we fear being alone with our self-hate. So we fill our lives with oases of success, happiness, or pleasure. We do anything to mask the emptiness, barrenness, and lifelessness of isolation. But all our attempts only make it worse. So, instead of running and hiding, I encourage you to show up like the Samaritan woman. Jesus is there to meet us wherever we are. Let yourself be known and loved. Where are you trying to hide from God and others? What is the source of shame in your life? Jesus wants to help us surface this, not so that it can hurt us, but so that it can stop hurting us, so that he can heal us. But we have to be willing to engage. So my challenge to you this week is to really make a commitment to set aside at least 15 minutes for a brief prayer exercise. God can speak so powerfully to us about the details of our lives when we use our imagination in prayer. So imagine yourself standing before Jesus in place of the Samaritan woman. Really picture it. Whatever you picture will be right. You can't get it wrong. Imagine the details as much as you can. What does the place look like? Imagine the hot sun, the well, and Jesus there with you. Realize that Jesus knows you. He knows your deepest, darkest secret, or even the junk that just piles up, the embarrassing things that happen in life. He sees it, and he loves you. The story of the Samaritan woman isn't just some story that happened to someone else. It's the story of you and me. This story doesn't tell us about how Jesus loved some woman 2,000 years ago. This is about how Jesus loves you right here, right now. When the story ends, we hear that the Samaritan woman runs into the town, telling everyone, "Come, see a man who told me everything I have done. He knows the most shameful things about me, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and still engaged with me. He loved me, and he set me on a new road." When we allow ourselves to be seen by the God who made us and loves us without condition, we can stop hiding and dwelling on our failures. We see our past and we are consumed with our failures. But God sees our past and gives us a way forward and a future.